Hello and welcome to episode number 26 of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simons, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value no matter where you are on your musical journey. If you are thinking about a career in music, if you are in music school now, a working musician, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. My guest this week is violinist Holly Mulcahy, Concertmaster of the Chattanooga Symphony and of the Wichita Symphony, where she also holds the title Partner for Audience Engagement. She's the founder of Arts Capacity, a nonprofit that brings live music, art, artists, and composers into prisons. Holly is also a soloist with orchestras and a recitalist with a particular focus on contemporary music. And she's a snappy writer with a blog called Neoclassical. Holly and I met just shy of 20 years ago when we started together in the Richmond Symphony in Virginia. We were there a similar amount of time and departed maybe within a year or so of each other. But as you'll hear in the interview, Holly made the brave move of leaving that secure orchestra job because she had a clear sense that it wasn't the right fit, but while she had a more clouded view of her future. But once she identified what was lacking and where she could add the most value, she remade herself as an institutional leader, both on stage and off, with a sharp focus on audiences and personal connection. And in a job market that is as hyper-competitive as ours, those questions of job match and personal satisfaction aren't ones that we typically get to entertain. And that she did ask and answer them is what makes Holly's story so interesting, instructive, and inspiring. Holly and I, in the intervening years since the Richmond Symphony, have navigated the career very differently, through different types of institutions and with very different roles within them. But we've arrived at a similar place, believing that there is a huge output gap between what the orchestral industry does now and what it is capable of. And that this is both a function of internal and external atrophy. Holly is working to strengthen those internal muscles to get the best out of employees and stakeholders, and to also develop the capacity to talk with, and more importantly, listen to, the external community. And she stresses that this is not a quick fix, but a long-term grassroots effort that takes time and sincerity and needs to be tended and watered. And when trust is built, orchestras and individual artists have the capacity to ask better questions and really listen to the answers. And that is where we'll find purpose again as institutions and as performing musicians within them. And as I've reflected on this conversation, I realized how deftly Holly manages the paradox of the institutional citizen, where one cultivates individual excellence in order to elevate an institutional purpose over personal preferences. Holly has a high-profile role for sure, but she uses it to strengthen the institution by connecting people to each other and to the art. I think too often the rhetoric in our industry's conversations become binary, that there's innovation for innovation's sake on one side and doing things the way they've always been done because that's the way they've always been done on the other. At the very least, they're both self-limiting. At worst, they are a recipe for purposelessness and irrelevance. The real skill in a legacy institution like orchestras is balancing tradition and newness, but measuring both against whether or not either has actual meaning for audiences and whether or not the organization is making its community a better place to live. I've mentioned the book on thinking institutionally on this podcast a few times because it has been so formative to my worldview. And talking with Holly so reminded me of a few sentiments from the book, this one especially. The author Hugh Heclo writes, quote, "Having a realistic, sober view of our human condition, the institutionalist understands that people usually have a greater need to be reminded than to be liberated. To repeat, this does not mean closing off thought to any new form of innovation. Quite the contrary. If we want things to stay the same, there are going to have to be some changes. Precisely because it regards itself as a legatee of something of great value, institutional thinking eagerly seeks to understand what has been received in light of new circumstances that are always intruding. Without appropriate adaptations, the legacy cannot be preserved." Please enjoy this interview with Holly Mulcahy. Holly Mulcahy, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me. You've had something of an unorthodox career in the sense that you've used traditional means untraditionally. And I have some thoughts on some overlapping and self-reinforcing things in classical music that create kind of a status quo that I think more often than we'd like it to leads to, for lack of a better word, just stagnation. And our job market has kind of this weird asymmetric distribution that pushes most of the job getting and the early job growth into the beginning of the career. And I think a consequence of that is that there are few economic incentives to grow over time. There's no place to move up to. Moving on is very difficult. Our schedule is super busy, so there's a trade-off of time as you get older between becoming to work super prepared and maintaining your practice versus like intentional improvement or maybe even starting new projects. And finally, these instruments are like pretty hard and the improvements come at the margins. And it's like, it takes a lot of effort to get a small return, but you have done all of those things. You've continued to grow, you've continued to move, you've continued to take on new projects. And I'm wondering if you talk to me about where in your professional life or maybe in your training, you saw that the channel or the funnel of classical music was a little too narrow for you and how you decided to make different choices.
That didn't come to me as easily. It came to me a little backwards. My first job with Richmond Symphony, first, full-time job, I just expected I would just walk in, you've got 38 weeks and it's just like a real goal job. And within a month, I knew I didn't want it. And from that point, I started making notes of why it didn't meet my expectations. Was it me? Was it the orchestra? And it was a little of both, actually. And so I kind of reverse engineered that. How did I get to that? How did I become expecting something that wasn't? And I just figured out that as a youth orchestra kid, back in high school, you go to youth orchestra, you are told what to do, what to play, and it's fun, and you have challenges. You can try to get a higher chair or whatever. And then the next thing is college, trying to get into college, so you're practicing really hard and you're working really hard to get into college. So you get there, and then the next thing is a job, and you practice really hard and you get your first job, and you practice really hard and you get your second job. Meanwhile, the whole time you're being told, here's what you play, here's when you show up, and that's it. And it was in that first real job that I discovered certain traits, what makes a good leader, what makes a bad leader, what expectations are on the musician, how is that important to me? And so I found that joy was missing in that the joy that I had in college orchestra and youth orchestra was missing. So you try to, figure out what is missing, and the challenge is gone. And like you just said, it's so important. Maybe it's important to some people, but when there's nowhere to go, when you finally get that job and there's nowhere to go, what do you do? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like that moment in my life where I realized that, I've got to make my own plans.
Do you think that's a structural flaw in the way our business is set up? But is that the root, do you think, of a lot of the dissatisfaction that we have as players? I mean, it's not just, you're not the only person to articulate this.
It's like you say, it's always been that way. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the catchphrase of our business. It's the way we always do things. Why change? And I think that's the biggest question is why. You start to ask, why are we doing this? And for me, as a musician, asking myself, why am I doing this? And I wrote a blog about this. If I can dig it up, I'll share it with you. You start to go back, why? And you keep asking yourself why. And your why can change from decade to decade. But I realized in the most recent decade that my why is that I enjoy the feeling of applause and audiences and the energy of a concert. But my real reason for sharing music is just that. It's sharing and having that communication with audiences. And so discovering that and knowing that that's my why gave me the direction that well, I want to be in a leadership position. Why? Because you can get to the audience easier. When you're a concertmaster or a principal, as you know, people recognize you and it's kind of a platform. Some people crave that. Some people are like, no, I just want to be in the section. I don't want to be known. Some people want to, engage, and I thrive on engaging. I love to hear people's reaction to music. That is so satisfying. So that's where my why of why I decided to get to this point.
When you said a minute ago that you had a certain amount of joy as a student, whether at youth orchestra or in college, do you think you could have put your finger on your why back then?
I think it was just the feeling of camaraderie, that feeling you have when you're in youth orchestra, that energy, it's so palpable. And as you probably have experienced as a professional musician, sometimes that energy is a little lacking in a professional orchestra because there is, various people, various, levels of their career. Some people are ready for retirement. They're not going to come in and play their A game every single time. And that kind of energy is contagious and it kind of deflates. Where when you're in a youth orchestra, everybody's, between 16 and 18 or whatever, and that energy is all just really on fire. So my why back then was, this feels really good. It was all about me, though. And I think that's one of the things that I like to think that I've improved and grown as a human. And it's not about me, it's about the audience. And that's where I really feel good knowing people are impacted by what we bring.
When I give talks or do kind of roundtables or master classes for college age students, the first thing I tell them is like, the main thing you're not going to think about in school when you get your first job is the intergenerational quality of a professional orchestra. And all the things you just said. It's not a bad thing, of course. I mean, there's a lot of shared wisdom, institutional knowledge, all these really wonderful things about being a part of people with different experiences, life experiences, different places in their life. But I'm wondering some of your thoughts then on how do we, as players, and let's take principals or concertmasters out of the equation for now and say, how do players push against that stagnation that can settle in? It's like college basketball versus the pros. People love college basketball because there's a certain like raw enthusiasm about it that's lost when you're playing 82 games a year as a pro and traveling the country. But what can we do you think, as players? What kind of like leadership can each individual player demonstrate or show to bring up the level of the institution?
That is such a good question. And I think the best thing I can say is the behavior and the attitudes of any individual are contagious. So if you bring in a negative attitude, that's going to be one of the worst things to just spread amongst the orchestra. And I think the negative energy and that bad attitude kind of feeling passes much faster than good attitudes. You have people who come in and they're like, hey, great to see you. I'm so excited we're playing Beethoven 9 for the 45th time. And that attitude can be like, ooh, who are you? Get out of my face. I just want to get through this rehearsal. But to be really aware of what you bring and that it does spread. One of the fun things when I walked away from my job in Richmond mid-season was I stopped playing for 3 months. And then I started to crave it again. So I took sub-auditions in some really great orchestras around the country. So I got to play the field, essentially. But I also saw different, the chemistry in each different orchestra and what the differences were and how people treated each other. And it was really interesting to watch that contagion of good attitude versus bad attitude. I'm not going to name the orchestras, but there was one orchestra with a bad hall, bad seat stands, bad seats on stage, a really fine conductor. The orchestra was top notch, like one of the best. And the attitudes were really good, very supportive, great camaraderie. There was no like, oh, this person's close to retirement, they're not pulling their weight. That was totally not it. Another orchestra on a flip side had a fantastic hall, great lighting, great seats, great stands, state-of-the-art everything. The most miserable group of people, they all hated their job and they were all complaining, and just you could see it just eroding and just kind of corroding their their being. And it's really interesting to see the power of bringing a good attitude and congratulating somebody on a solo and not complaining about the obvious. Not complaining about the obvious. That's so easy.
Yeah, it's such an interesting observation. And if you get the opportunity to play in different established places that have established cultures, it's interesting to observe. When I was in the Phoenix Symphony, there was a lot of camaraderie in the group because we were involved in trench warfare against the management and our music director at the time. And so that actually was a binding force. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's true. And then when I was at the same time, I was subbing in some really top level orchestras, and I noticed that they play great, but it was much more businesslike. There was a lot less interpersonal stuff. I'm wondering though, going back to your leadership and your concertmaster role, then is that one of the main thrusts of your leadership then, is like trying to influence attitudes and the sort of the mindset that people bring to work?
Absolutely. I think in all the jobs that I've had and all the subbing that I've done with various orchestras, it has allowed me to watch different leadership styles, what's effective, what isn't effective. And watching some various concertmasters like David Kim in Philadelphia, who else? Frank Almond in Milwaukee, just retired. I could name a bunch, but there are those that are kind and bring an attitude of professionalism and set a tone and set a mood. If a concertmaster is antagonistic with the conductor, that will fall through the ranks so fast, and you can't undo that at all. It just cannot be done. So it's important to not be combative with a conductor, a guest conductor, and to be a liaison to try to keep things calm. I have to tell you a story. My friend, Ralph Mattson, a former concertmaster of Utah, I learned so much from just watching him. He had... we had a guest conductor on the podium, and the guest conductor kept saying, musicians, what dynamic do you see at letter 13 or number 13? And he kept doing that. It was so insulting. And finally, the assistant concertmaster was really dismissive to the conductor. It was very embarrassing for everybody. We were all like, oh gosh, what did he just do? And minutes went by, and Ralph totally diffused the situation, and he said, respectfully, of course. And he just took that energy, that negative energy from this assistant concertmaster just screaming back at the conductor, and he diffused it gracefully. And I think it's that kind of tone that really impacted the importance for me of, if you don't work at keeping an even keel, if you raise your voice at somebody who's maybe incompetent, it's not going to do your section any good, and it'll only bring out their angst. They will mirror whatever you do. So that was a really big influence for leadership and tone of voice.
Yeah, there's probably a big quality of managing up as a concertmaster, like managing that I hadn't really thought of that, but of course that's the case. Do you think there's an analogy to, like, the type of teacher that harps on like really micromanaging technique versus talking about really high level stuff and letting kind of the student find their way? So in other words, there are certain section leaders who will berate their sections about technical stuff. And are you kind of seeing yourself as more setting like a tone, so to speak, maybe not like an audible tone, but like setting the tone about the way you're going about business?
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate, I spend my summers in the Grand Teton Music Festival normally, is sitting in the section and sitting in the back, the last chair sometimes, and watching the feelings when somebody in a principal position turns around and says, violin 2, we're not playing this right, or, I'm hearing a lot of wrong notes or whatever. And feeling the hackles on the back of my neck stand up, like, who do you think? Of course we heard that was out of tune, or of course we know we messed up. You don't need to berate us or whatever. To know that feeling helps me dictate how I lead. I think that my sections know I trust them. I trust them as musicians, as professional musicians. And if they don't stand up to that level, I've learned from David Kim in Philadelphia, there's nice ways to ask for things. Like if the orchestra or if the section's not playing in tune, you can say, hey, let's make our G sharps a little higher so that leading tone will be, really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't tell anybody that they sucked. It told everybody, hey, let's make that G sharp awesome. So, just watching him lead and invite people to rise to the occasion was awesome. And it was so inspiring. And if things still aren't great in a section, that's when you say, maestro in the dressing room, I have some ideas. I don't want to single anybody out, and you discuss it out, because egos are so powerful and you don't want any hurt feelings, because then you get that negative seed that's planted and all of a sudden it starts to spread.
Yeah, and it spreads in concerts, right? That's what I noticed. Like it diminishes. You lose, if let's say every concert maybe loses 5% accuracy just because of the nerves and the excitement of the whole thing, which might not be a bad thing. If there's a toxic relationship, it gets way worse in the show. So it's almost compounded that way. I'm wondering if, as a section or as a concertmaster, do you find it's an important counterbalance to spend some time playing in the back of the section? I'll say from personal experience, I would say that sitting in the front circle is easier to play. I think psychologically it's harder because you're carrying a lot of they're carrying the burden of trying to make everyone do their best job or help everyone do their best job. And so if it doesn't go well, you take it at least I do. I take it quite not personally, but I feel it I feel it internally. However, I recognize that sitting in the back of the second fiddle section and trying to, when you can't hear anybody but it's yourself, that's a real challenge. So I'm wondering, do you find that it's not essential, but at least helpful for you to spend some time each season kind of seeing it from the exact opposite place on stage?
Oh yeah. At the times that I do my summer festivals, I do take that in completely. And, we rotate our concertmasters and our principals in the summer festival. And there will be some that will thank people on the last stand because they know it sucks themselves. There will be some that says, I want to make sure I got that bowing back to you. And that's appreciated. Then there's some that don't. And you notice that. And I think it helps you become very empathetic. For me, it makes me check in. It encourages me to check in with everybody in my sections. Now, we rotate our sections as much as possible. So everybody knows that experience, of last stand or, in the back of the orchestra, and that it's not easy. I always ask, is there anything that, are you getting the bowings back? Are you able to see? Is there anything I can help you with? Because I know.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people have good ideas. So listening to them and acknowledging that, they care as much as I do empowers them, and it empowers the whole orchestra.
Did you start to see that people started expressing more ideas over time as they became more comfortable with you, as you set a different kind of tone as a leader?
I think so. Yeah, definitely.
So going back a little bit to when you left the Richmond Symphony as a full-time section player and decided to take a different turn, if I'm hearing you correctly, was that you just simply wanted to have more impact on the organization, on the direction of the organization, and maybe just improve the workplace overall, which isn't really the province of many section players.
Kind of. At Richmond Symphony was more of like a frustration because I felt like I'm not going anywhere. Meanwhile, I was auditioning everywhere. And I even won a couple of jobs actually, but I didn't take them because it was like out of the frying pan into the fire, just it's going to be the same kind of level. But with Richmond, there was like what you mentioned earlier, there is no room for growth. Mm-hmm. Once you're a section player, your only step up is if there is a principal position that's open in that orchestra or another orchestra. But there does become a point where you just can't go on anymore. For me, for Richmond, I think it just was I didn't know what I didn't know yet. I knew I was not happy. And I knew that I wasn't feeling appreciated, or that I think that it was like, I didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that also dictates how I lead with my section is I want everybody to know that they matter
Mm-hmm.
tremendously. And I think that was one of the things that was lacking in that orchestra at that time. I'm sure it's totally different. It's been like, what, 20 years?
It's been a long time since we were there.
Yeah.
Yeah, look,
So
my experience there wasn't fantastic, but I also recognize that I bore a lot of the responsibility of that, and you take those learning experiences to the next place, and you
you
try a different
do.
iteration of yourself. You're hopefully it's a ladder. They call it a career ladder for a reason. Like you get to a higher step, and it's like you bring the investments that came before, and you bring it to that place. But I'm not sure we're pointing fingers at any particular institution. It's more the system, and that
It is the system.
and
Yeah.
so as you wanted to move into it, reposition yourself within that system, you wanted to obviously shape, inform the music, the performances, and so let me ask you, how does your blogging fit into this kind of nudging? Like there's this kind of almost like architecture that you set up where you kind of have this writing presence, you have this performing presence, and they all do kind of talk about some of the same things, right? There's connection, there's one-on-one, it's very personal, and a lot of your blogging goes into these attitude issues, how to present yourself. Where does that practice fall into your overall ethos?
The blogging is instead of complaining about our industry, it was an outlet.
Mm-hmm.
And that outlet, when I first started writing, was mostly negatively backed. It was like, oh, I'm mad at this, I'm going to write about that, when I first started. And then it transferred into how can I make it better? And I started to kind of balance it out to philosophies, observations. I try to make them kind of funny sometimes, not on purpose funny, but just to get people to think. I had a 4-part series of how to alienate your audience in 10 easy steps.
That's great.
From the music director point of view, the board, the staff, and orchestra musicians. Everything from not smiling on stage as an orchestra musician, don't smile. If you want to alienate your audience, don't do it. So I think it's more of a discovery that it bridged into discovering, and the thought process helped shape ideas, and ideas shaped into actual actions.
It's almost like a teaching. There's an element of teaching in there, right? So you're sharing your experience and observations, which is a lot of teaching. Do you do any teaching now?
I stopped teaching altogether when we moved to Chicago. I do residencies at universities, coaching and master classes. I kind of got burned out on teaching, really good at it. But there became a point where I just I wanted to focus on my own practicing and other things.
When you express to aspiring students and aspiring professional musicians, what about your own training have you seen was wrong, right? Or that you're somewhat misinformed about how things actually worked, or better ways of thinking about stuff? How are you teaching this generation of musicians differently, perhaps, than you were informed?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think when I was in school and college, there wasn't a purpose. I mean, you practice, you get a job, you get paid. And even my teacher at Peabody was like, whoever makes the most money is winning. So I was like, well, that's healthy. So giving these students, asking them a why are you doing this? What's your goal? And and give them the option, you're allowed to change that, I think makes them think. But also I want them to know about the financial responsibilities of the career they're getting into. Some are music majors, some are music education majors, and they'll, for instance, an undergraduate will ask, I really want to get a master's in music education. I'm kind of getting up in student loans, and so I ask them, what is there a way that you can get a teaching job now and then have the school pay for a master's? Because there's a whole return on investment kind of thing. you're putting so much money into this music career, or your performing career. You buy your instruments, you buy your schooling, and after a while, you've got this huge student loan debt, and you might get a job, your first job, at $20,000 a year, if you're lucky. You might get that. And so, are you going to be able to teach? Are you going to be able to, fulfill your financial obligations with other work? Or what else can you do? How creative can you be? So we talk about, not musical entrepreneur, because that's schools doing that, or I think are doing it wrong. But just getting the students to actually articulate that they understand that what they're putting in, they might not get back. And that's terrifying, but it's honest.
Can you talk to me a little bit about what schools are teaching entrepreneurship incorrectly?
It's a huge buzzword, and it was buzzword before the pandemic hit, where they try to teach students how to teach and how to balance a career in like gigging and some other things, but it's cobbled together and it's not really organized. And I think a true entrepreneur makes work for themselves, but is able to understand balances and, like I mentioned before, the return on investment on this. I think that schools are using this to lure students in, because you look at paying, school right now, $65,000 a year for conservatory, maybe it's more, plus housing, plus your instrument, plus, eating and all the details of life. That's a hard sell when there's not many orchestra jobs, and especially now. There's nothing open right now with the pandemic. It's a hard sell. So how do you get students to come into school as music majors? Oh, we've got a great entrepreneurial class.
Right. So entrepreneurship, as I understand it, in a pure sense, is the pursuit of opportunities beyond the resources currently controlled. And so that, like you said, there is a creative element to that that's different than balancing a gigging career, like accepting, because that's freelancing in the purest sense versus entrepreneurship. What I have noticed, though, about some of the more high profile people who would be held up as the avatars of entrepreneurship is that, yeah, there is an element of like booking hotel gigs or booking weddings and things like that. But there's also a creative element that I think that when we were coming up as students, like that just wasn't really there. So there's maybe like 20% of the book that is like this cool recording project, and you're, working with singer-songwriters or whatever it is, that you are the driving creative force behind this thing. But then the rest of it does look an awful lot like a regular freelancing career.
Yeah.
But you have created different opportunities now from an institutional platform. Talk to me about some of the non-traditional things that you've done as a concertmaster. In particular, I want to hear about your work in prisons.
That started maybe 6 years ago down in Chattanooga. From that, I created a nonprofit under my own.
Oh, I didn't know. Okay.
I formed a board, and the details where the orchestra wasn't really, they couldn't wrap their heads around how to,
my mistake,
come together.
Okay.
And that's fine. What I started was I just went in and played recital the first time I went to prison. And I presented Bach, a lot of solo Bach, and a lot of violin solos that were new music. And I used the prison at the time because I had a recital in Wyoming. Mm-hmm. So I played my repertoire. I thought, these folks are going to love Bach. Who doesn't love Bach? And I'm terrified to play the Higdon for them, the Mark Mellits, the Jem Stevenson. This is going to be a little stretch maybe, because I'm just going to assume that it's going to be hard for them. Boy, was I wrong. 100% wrong. The Bach was okay. It was good. The Higdon blew their mind. And so that taught me just a whole bunch of things, never to assume, never to try to, think that, oh, you're new to classical music, or that you're new to classical music. that taught me that never to assume that people are going to like something. You know, there is no starting point. You don't have to start at Bach. You don't have to start at Mendelssohn. I'm going to give you Higdon your first time. You might like it the first time. There's no rules. So that taught me that. But it also opened a huge floodgate of opportunity as far as partnering with composers and getting commissions written with the composer and the prisoners. And so creating new music with all of these components from people who are not heard and people who don't really get enough ears listening to their music. So it was a beautiful support system of getting a 300-person audience to hear a world premiere by a living composer, and the living composer many times could join into that. So that opened up a lot of learning as far as how to engage with audiences, how to ignite imaginations, how to invite people in to understand the art, to own that art as their own, and allow and invite them to feel however they needed to. And that was just huge.
Do you have any theories on why the Higdon and the new music went over better than the Baroque stuff?
I think these prisoners, they did not have, well, they don't typically have art come in like this. I mean, they'll have like volunteer choruses come in, but mostly they've got CNN and reality TV in the dorms. And when they get something like this, they come by choice. They don't have to come to these recitals. They want to be there. They are 100% invested, and they allow the music to wash over them the way our normal audiences would never think to. I brought in I can bring in about 20 people each time, 20 people from, the outside. And what's fascinating is watching these regular concert goers, the classical aficionados, listening through prisoners' ears, who are listening 100%. They're leaning in, they're really taking it in, they're trying to understand. And you invite them to share their feelings. They don't get asked how they feel or what they're thinking or at all. They're your prisoner number 4, 5, 6, 7. Go back to your dorm or whatever. And it's, there's no, how are you feeling? I'm feeling fine. I'm feeling sad. There's none of that. So this opportunity to really be invited to share what they thought of a piece is awesome. And they've taught some of our audiences how to listen better. Prisoner feels that his dead mother's presence during the Higdon second movement of String Poetic, that's going to inform a regular classical music listener to listen a little more intently, a little more inwardly. It's pretty powerful.
Indeed. Do you think that maybe as programmers, we then overestimate how much our audience prefers standard repertoire to new repertoire?
We are terrible. Our industry across the board is terrible at how we invite our audiences in. There's a lot of assuming. We look at our budgets and say, oh gosh, we need to sell a lot of tickets. We better do a Beethoven 9, because that's good. And it does fill the house because people know they're going to be satisfied, but you have to build this trust. And it doesn't take, a year or two. It takes 5 or 10, with a music director who's been there long enough to really engage with the audience, musicians, top to bottom in an orchestra, engaging with the audience, getting people, listening to people, getting their impression. Somebody might say that Berlioz just rocked my mind. And the musician can say, oh, you like that Berlioz? I'm going to recommend a Nielsen, Symphony 4 for you that is going to blow your mind past this Berlioz. You like that? You're going to love this. And so you just start to shape it like it's a great experience. And we've got your back. And whenever you come to XYZ Philharmonic, you're going to be taken care of and your feelings are going to be paramount. I don't think we do a really good job at that right now across the board.
I think one thing that the harshest critics of orchestral institutions don't understand is there is a pressure from audiences. Like there is a true pressure on empowered members of audiences they tend to be quite conservative. And there is like a fiduciary problem that we have in terms of being able to schedule to program what we want. The flip side of that, though, as I listen to you talk about the prisoners, is maybe it's like a chicken and the egg thing that we started it and the audiences pick up, but it doesn't matter. The point is there's like a self-reinforcing conservatism in some institutions between the audience and the programming. And I wonder how do we break that cycle? How do we get to that more unstructured and candid reaction to the music that you describe within the prisons?
I think that you have to take a psychiatry kind of viewpoint, and you're going to have to look at various parts of the audience. You've got the aficionados, the ones that want the conservative, they want the meat and potatoes, the Beethoven, the concerto, the Brahms, or the Brahms, the Chopin, and the Tchaikovsky.
Sorry to interrupt, Holly, someone, an important member of my community said to me, "I like my composers dead."
Yeah. That's funny. One of my friends, or not friends, one of our audiences came up to me and said, "I like that so much, I thought the composer was dead."
Right.
I was like, good. But I think looking at and communicating with these people, taking a psychological aspect from like a psychiatrist point of view, acknowledging that they love this, but then nudging them and inviting them. And I think what we don't do well in this industry across the board is we do not listen. We don't actually listen to the audience. We are hearing them say, "I like Brahms." We're not hearing what they're not saying, or what they are afraid to say is, I like the most tender music that, reverberates a certain way. We don't ask the questions to get to that point. And we do not have that communication that is in the prison. We are terrible listeners. We hear what we want to hear, and then we shut off.
But the orchestra industry, maybe not all, but at least the ones I've worked for, we tend to almost saturate our audiences with surveys. Are you saying that they were asking the wrong questions in those surveys, or is it just too impersonal?
Yes, on both of those. The surveys are fixed to get a particular answer. And you can doctor those surveys to lead people into questions to answer a particular way. Almost all the surveys I've ever seen or sent out through the various orchestras I've been affiliated with have been leading questions, and it's frustrating because it's like you don't leave. Of course, there's leave your comments, but who wants to do that? What's more powerful and takes more energy is the grassroots kind of, let's sit down and have a cup of coffee, and let's talk about Brahms, and let's talk about Schoenberg afterwards. There's a connection there. Let's find out. And I think inviting people to discover on their own and make it, if you can get your typical meat and potatoes, I like my composers dead kind of person, to the preacher of great works of living composers, you have won that battle. And then they can start to preach to everybody else. Once you get that, they'll start their own networking, like, "Oh my goodness, have you heard the latest John Adams, choral or whatever?" And I've done that with audiences time and time again. But it's listening, really listening, and then inviting them to discover, because once they discover, everything you said goes off to the side, and they're going to be so fixated on this Nielsen concerto or this John Adams or this Higdon or whatever.
Yeah, and I think we also have to say that contemporary music as we think of it has changed quite a bit over the past half century. Yeah, and it's really, that's an important distinction. And I think that the learned response of some of our more seasoned concert goers to what a new piece is going to sound like, that it's not entirely, they're not entirely wrong to think that they were getting into something that was going to be uncomfortable.
Totally.
As we now have several generations now, but especially most living composers at this point are writing music that as accessible as maybe the best word, but it's tied to what most people would identify as music. It has musical qualities that they can identify. I wonder, though, I still want to go back to this idea of the prisoners that bring so little preconceived ideas to the performance, and how there is no barrier to their listening experience. Do you think it's partly an issue of proximity, like because you're so close to them? I mean, you're talking, it's a small room probably. Do you think, maybe what I'm asking is there something about this work that you do kind of one-on-one or with small groups that you're able to recreate that kind of real essence, that real tangible quality that you get with the prisoners, that you're able to get, that would be hard to do in the 2,000 seat concert hall?
I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I think you're going to like it. The evolution of the prison concerts started with 76 odd in the audience, and we played in the prison chapel. And the next time I came in, played for 150. All of it's volunteer. And the next time, 250. And the next time,
so it's pretty big.
Close to 400. So the word gets around, but also within each of those times I built trust. I remembered some of them. They remembered me. But they each came by, shook my hand, which was allowed in this prison. And they each said, this meant so much to me or whatever. And, I thanked them for sharing what they wanted. They also had surveys to let me know how their experience was. And we asked some hard questions in the survey. But to get to know them, from 76 people to almost 400, that was an incredible amount of trust that we built together. They didn't trust me, I didn't trust them. And by the end of the last time I performed, there was an immense amount of trust. I could bring anything into that prison, and I know it would be received with open ears and open hearts right now because of that trust. It took a lot of work. And that's exactly what we need to do on a bigger scale in the concert halls, is to start with something small, build the trust, build the curiosity, because that curiosity is contagious, and then start to get it bigger. And once you get that trust, it just starts to have this atmosphere of, give me more, push more onto me. I'm ready, hit me up. We become dealers essentially.
Yeah, there's such a part of classical music, and it's not just the orchestra by any means. It's our whole industry, where there is almost like a ritualistic quality to what we do, rather than like the lack of curiosity, like you said.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself, why do we get to this ritualistic thing? And it's all based on traditions that are long dead and long gone and just so irrelevant anymore. And there are no rules. We don't have to show up in tuxedos. I mean, according to the CBA, maybe we do, the collective bargaining agreement. But there's nothing that says you're going to enjoy this Tchaikovsky symphony more if people are wearing tuxes over black turtlenecks or whatever. I mean, of course, the uniformity would be great, but there are no rules.
Talk to me about some of the innovations you've done, these Wellness Wednesdays, and you're doing. I know that you did a whole bunch of Zoom concerts during the pandemic. Talk to me about some of the things, both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, that you've done to kind of have one-on-one contact with your audiences.
Pre-pandemic, I started an initiative with the Wichita Symphony of having a post-concert hang at a restaurant or bar afterwards, where I invite the musicians, the staff, the audience, just for a hang. And what's really interesting about that is you get, here was my enjoyment factor from the concert. Well, here was mine. And so you get this rounded from different views of the concert experience. The musician might say, oh, I really screwed up that second movement solo. And the audience member saying, oh, I thought it was great. And you really moved me to a different, place. And so you start to build these friendships, and it just kind of like punctuates the concert experience. Because I think it's silly to walk out the stage door and go home immediately. And same for the audience, to walk out of the lobby and just go home. Maybe you go out for a drink afterwards, but why not like hug it out afterwards or talk about it or laugh about it or just share your perspective? Because that's what art really boils down to, is the communication. And if you're not communicating, why did you just do that big concert? You know, that's just stupid.
As I've gotten older, and part of the ritualistic thing, I think, is also we just play so many damn concerts, right? There's just so many of them that you can't help but fall into a groove. That said, you can break that groove up if you meet new people after every show. If you're kind of
You don't
out
have to do it after every show, but my goodness, like do a post-mortem once in a while, a big hang. The groove thing terrifies me, by the way. So
I hear what you're saying about maybe you don't have to do a post-concert dinner every show, but I find that, I'll be honest, the part of this pandemic and what I miss the most in the streaming concerts is not like the reciprocity of the audience and all that stuff. It's the actually meeting people after or before the show. That I would always like make a big effort to go out and just kind of see people and let that kind of synergy happen.
Oh, I was going to say there's one thing that's missing across the board, and I would love to have this changed, is after the concert, everybody should be bounding to the lobby to meet the audience before they get into the parking garage.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
I do that every concert I can, but it's hard to ask people to do that. So it's easier to say, hey, let's all go to the bar afterwards. Musicians will do it anyway. Audience invited along. It just makes it more fun. That camaraderie only builds. So it was one of the things before the pandemic. Since then, like you mentioned, I started a weekly Zoom recital. We started it in April and went all the way to the end of September. And within that had 14 world premieres, 29 living composers as guests, and from around the world. And we grew from, just the Wichita audiences, because we basically beamed into a retirement center, to 35 states and 5 countries. And it was really exciting to expand this. And we tried different things each time. One of the great things about the executive director in Wichita is he's very supportive of trying new initiatives, especially now, because what else are you going to do? So just try stuff. So we had a different angle each week. One time I brought in a comedy improv expert to talk about improvisation and how to use that, and brought in composers, brought in soloists, brought in Fred Child. It was just fun, but it gave people a weekly thing to do when we're all locked down. And this latest thing, Wednesday Wellness with the Wichita Symphony. When I was in Wichita in November, I do my normal thing. I have coffee, lunch, dinner with various audience members, patrons, donors. And I heard the most disturbing thing from, over and over at these various coffees, that people were worried about their mental health in the coming months. And that just really struck me as like, gosh, I'm hearing it from so many people, the same thing, and from people from different backgrounds, which terrified me. So I thought, I've got to do something. We've got to do something. We've got our Zoom platform kind of already built in. We've got the audience already there. We have a method. We have ideas. And so I formed a task force of an emergency room doctor, a psychiatrist, music therapist, our music director, and me. And each week we're experimenting with various wellness themes, all to do with classical music. We are just kind of finding our way in the dark with this, but it's been really rewarding because, once a week we'll get a note from a patron saying, I just got through surgery, that music therapy technique about relaxation with music really helped. And I feel like I can take control of my body. I was like, dang, that's cool. It's really powerful.
Do you feel like this might lead, particularly because you're bringing on clinicians, that this might lead to greater institutional connection between the symphony and a hospital? And maybe this might, once things become safer, it might burgeon into a larger project?
I do. I think my goal was this, and I've got a fantastic music director. We both see eye to eye on this, is we're trying to build our current audience's appreciation of music in a different way, how to use it differently. But we're also building a new audience, and the whole thing is super intentional. You're listening to a Brahms symphony, very different, very purpose-filled, with a goal. And so when we return to the stage, we're hoping that it impacts people much more profoundly, where they can really own their experiences, use the music, feel confident with how they feel. Because a lot of times audiences, they don't feel like they're enjoying it the right way. They wonder, am I doing it right? And they lose 2-hour concert wondering. And this will give them a key to owning what they just bought a ticket for. And so we're hoping to incorporate, a lot of the things we're discovering from the music therapist and the psychiatrist as we go, because there's a lot we're finding that is really salient.
As the orchestra, because of COVID and these innovations that we've had to come up with, and we become a little bit less, or a little bit untethered from place, maybe? Do you, in the sense that you just said we reached however many states and different countries, and that to some degree, that's the great hope, I think, is that orchestras will be able to expand their audiences on the margins, I suppose, but still overseas or across state lines. How do you think that might affect the potential for performers? So you are kind of like a national, you have like a national presence, and you make your home in the Midwest, but you travel to these other places for your jobs. Do you think that COVID might allow musicians to think about having a more mobile career in the future rather than being tethered to one place?
I don't know. I don't necessarily think so. I think watching a lot of my colleagues who are tethered to an orchestra right now, I'm seeing them rethink the whole career altogether. They're going into programming, they're going to real estate, they're going into
So it's just
coding.
like a full-on career change.
Full-on career change. And there are some that are looking on to keeping their job and adding on a part-time job of, realty and a couple other things. But I think that the return on investment for switching that up is going to be really high risk for people just kind of dabbling into that. I think it's going to have to, I get the impression that it's not going to be as easy as we think traveling.
Okay, let me ask a different way then. When we come back as someone that has a passion for reaching people in any way that you can, in any format, I look at some people that I either am acquainted with or know well, or people I've had on this podcast, and not everyone, but there's many different visions of what might happen afterwards. And so I think of like one friend I've got who's got a really great career as a singer-songwriter, and he tours the English-speaking world pretty regularly before all this, and spent a lot of time on the road, and had been working that down, like trying to get from like 120 concerts a year down to like 60 days on the road, because as he got older, family and stuff. But the pandemic shut everything down. He actually created like a really good sounding concert series from his basement, basically, and has created a little community around it. That not all of us can do that, but that's just one example. The flip side is one of my recent guests is another singer-songwriter, and I asked her, are you going to be thinking about maybe creating less travel? And she was like, absolutely not. We're going to hit the road. We're going to go out hard. People are going to be dying to hear, So I wonder, how do you think this might shake out for classical musicians, though, besides outside of changing jobs? What opportunities do you think might be there past a vaccine? And the answer might be, quite frankly, we need to double down on making great live performances. But just kind of picking your brain about how people might think about their careers a little differently, and what might be possible that we didn't think was possible before all this.
Well, like you said, there's a lot of opportunity. The creating your own like recording studio. I think a lot of musicians are discovering that there is no limit with the internet. You can be performing in other states or countries as much as you want. I've done a number of recitals remotely this way. It doesn't replace the true experience. What I'm good at is, communicating with people directly. And while you can do it over Zoom, the impact of the sound isn't as
Of course.
satisfying. I don't think that's got a long shelf life, honestly. I really don't. But there are a lot of other opportunities. I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we're looking at and not seeing. I think it's just right there and we're not seeing. As far as orchestras doubling down with the live experience, yeah, my biggest fear is people are going to get back and get all, teary when they play their first, big concerto or big concert, and then a week will go by and then you forget and you go right back to, gosh, these lights are terrible, it's shining right in my eye, or this stand is so wobbly. Just, how can we even, somebody's got to fix that. How long is it going to take to get from euphoria to complaining again? That's my biggest fear. And I don't know if there's an answer to that. That's just a fear. But doubling down, really leaning into it, is going to take engaging with audiences on the sincerest level, everybody in the orchestra, and actually listening to the audience, not telling them how they should think, what they should feel, and projecting your own feelings about your orchestra as a musician, but listening. That's one thing that I learned to do in prison is listen. It took me a couple of times. Prisoner would say, "Hey, can you play, The Devil Down in Georgia?" I'm like, no, of course not. And then I realized bluegrass terrifies me. So I learned how to do bluegrass. I came back a couple of times later, played it, not great, but I played it. And that built a connection. So I listened. It took me a while, but I listened. You listen to what they want and you try to fulfill it and meet them. I know in one of your emails to me, you mentioned the word outreach. Outreach is not just reaching out, but it's also meeting, your listener. So it's a skill that I don't think we're super at in this industry-wide.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there will be a honeymoon period after this is over where everybody's ecstatic to be back. But like you said, there's a good chance that we'll fall back into a groove and lean on our worst habits. I think the way we break that, though, is a lot of the stuff that you said. And I think it's if you feel more responsibility for creating connection with people in your community. And I mean, that's one-on-one. I think it's something you've been really a great advocate for. And something I really learned from my former boss in Louisville is that, yes, we are these big institutions and we've been around forever. And every weekend, a few thousand people come through our doors. And that's great. Like they are scaled to a really big level that sometimes we don't appreciate. But the one-on-one stuff, that sort of person-to-person campaigning on behalf of the institution, but also campaigning on behalf of it, like the community, is that bonding stuff that for me, that's been the real payback at this point in my career.
That's awesome.
Okay, Holly, I think this is probably a pretty good place to wrap up. Do you have any recommendations on things to listen to, film, music?
Books. Two books.
TV shows?
These are the must-get books, and I recommend these to everybody. Everybody at the Wichita Symphony has got this book that I'm going to recommend first. It's called Yes and by Kelly Leonard from the Second City in Chicago. And I've posted this on Facebook numerous times. I've bought copies for my board for Arts Capacity, the prison program that I run. It's all about communication. It's all about improv. And it's something that orchestras need top down. And to just summarize what Yes and is, it's an improv, a comedy improv skill of listening to somebody. So there's like a comedy troupe, maybe there's two people, and you're just improving a scene. You don't know where you're starting, you don't know where you're ending. If I tell you, my cat just ate his whole dinner in one sitting, I just informed you, my cat just ate, you can go, okay. Or you can acknowledge that my cat just ate the whole dinner and say, yeah, my cat ate his whole dinner too, but that was only because, it was a Tuesday and whatever. I'm just making some stupid example. But it's acknowledging somebody and then anding. So yes, I acknowledge what you just said and then adding on to it. And as you know, in the orchestra business, when we have our various meetings, our committee meetings, in any level, board, staff, orchestra meetings, it's always no, because, I think we should get better, programs. No, because we can't afford it. I think we need to have more guest conductors. No, because. Yes, and is a fantastic philosophy. And this book will take you through the communication. It takes you through various improv games, and it will ignite your creativity and make you want to be a better contributor. It will make you want your colleagues to join in. Highly, 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 highly recommended.
Okay.
Everybody in the arts should have this. Board member, staff member, orchestra member, get it. You'll learn how to talk. The other book is called Cork Dork. And this is the biggest metaphor on how to sell our art. We're selling dead white guys, basically. Unfortunately, that's the bulk of it. We hope we're going to, increase the diversity, because there's so much good music out there that's underrepresented. But when you look at what we're selling, stuff that people don't need. Just like wine, you don't need wine. Mm-hmm. And wine is like a culture. You think that you want to be a particular aficionado of the Chardonnay region. It's a snobbery thing. Mm-hmm. This book breaks down wine sales from the sommelier all the way to the competitions, and why and how wine gets sold, and how it can be like approachable for like the noob. So what it does is it breaks down, it builds curiosity. It's exactly what we should be doing as artists. It's the biggest metaphor for our business. So those two books have nothing to do with music, but everything to do with music.
That's fantastic. Well, Holly, thank you so much for making time. It was great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. The music on the show, as always, is by Craig Wagner, great guitar virtuoso from Louisville, Kentucky. Our next interview will feature the singer-songwriter Ben Solee, so please go ahead and hit subscribe.